This video is for protectionism and the diagrams that can be used for protectionist methods, especially as a form of expenditure switching policy. So let's start off with a tariff. What is a tariff? A tariff is a tax on imports. So if we have a look at this diagram is going to be kind of the foundations of every international trade diagram we're going to look at in this video. And we've got world supply as perfectly elastic. Now, the reason for that is just think about the sheer number of countries there are in the world and producers coming from those countries. Theoretically, we would expect a perfect response by at least one producer from one country if there was a change in price. Now, the domestic supply is only from 0 to Q1, which highlights the reason why we're importing these goods, because this country is not as efficient as global producers, and therefore we're importing the difference between Q1 and Q2, so that's our volume of imports. Now, if the government is going to implement a tariff, they want to reduce that volume. So how do they do it with a tariff? They place a tax, and that tax increases the price from world price to world price 2. So that difference between the two is going to be the tax revenue towards the government per unit. So what happens there is total demand previously was at Q2, but now it is at Q4. So demand has contracted because there's an increase in price. But because there's an increase in price, it means that domestic producers are more able and willing to produce. So that extends to Q3. So that means domestic supply now increases in terms of the difference from 0 to Q3. And the volume of imports has fallen from the difference of Q3 to Q4 now. Now, if we're looking at the welfare, and we're looking at what welfare possibly has been lost, well, look at the consumer surplus. The consumer surplus was initially A, B, D, E, F, and G. But because that world price is now world price 2, the consumer surplus is only A and D now. So B, F, E, and G has been lost. Now, some of that has been gained. So, for example, B has been gained by the producer, and E has been gained by the government in terms of tax revenue, because the volume of imports times by the tax per unit is that area of E, and that will be a gain in tax revenue. But F and G has not been gained, and it is simply just a net loss of welfare. So this table should kind of help illustrate that. Right, the next one. Let's have a look at a quota. So what is a quota? Well, a quota is a physical restriction on how many imports you can get into a country. So if we have a look at this, again, the world supply being perfectly elastic, the volume of imports is between Q1 and Q2, but now a quota has been implemented, which means a physical restriction. So how much are we importing in this country now? We're only importing between Q2 and Q3. That is the only amount of imports that are allowed in this country now. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new supply curve. Now this new supply curve is S1, but with those imports as well. So it's domestic supply plus the imported quota. So those arrows are meant to be the same in terms of distance. So what we have is a reduction in what is allowed to be exported or imported into that country by foreign exporters. Now, the issue of this is if you're an international exporter looking at this market, you've lost so many efficiencies. Your ability to achieve economies of scale for this country is now being reduced. And the reason for that is because previously you had a lot of bulk transportation benefits. So for example, if you think about containerization, previously you could fill up containers and you could spread that cost over that container and your unit cost would have fallen. But now, I don't know, let's say you've got half a container, it's just not as efficient. So you're now not really, as a foreign producer, willing to supply it at that world price. You want to sell it at a higher price to make up for those lost efficiencies. So for example, at world price 2. Now that world price 2 is going to be the price for domestic suppliers and global suppliers for that volume that is allowed into the country. Now that's going to cause a contraction in demand. So previously total demand was at Q1, but now it's at Q4. Now what we're going to experience is an increase in producer surplus. So even though consumer surplus was previously there, consumer surplus has clearly fallen, but as consumer surplus falls because of the higher price, domestic producer surplus increases to that green area. Now what we also have, because of this falling consumer surplus, we have this triangle here, but we also have this area here, which is not being gained by anyone domestically, but the purple area, it has been gained by someone. And it has been gained by international producers because those international producers are now selling it at a higher price, so that is going to be international producer surplus. But we're still going to consider it as a net welfare loss because it's not a domestic gain, it's an international gain. So what we have now is that area of the purple and the blue triangle as our deadweight loss. Right, the next one, a trade subsidy. So what is a trade subsidy? It's there to protect and support firms in handling competition. So that could be competition from obviously foreign imports, but it could also be helping them to compete internationally with their exports as well. So what we have again is we have that world supply and that world price. Now what we're going to do is the government is going to support these firms by giving them money which can help to cover their costs of production. So at any price now they can supply more goods, hence why we've got that supply shift to the right. Now, if we want these domestic suppliers to produce at Q3, they're not going to produce at Q3 unless they get a higher price per unit. So even though the producer is selling at world price 1, they're actually receiving P2 from the government. So in other words, the cost to the government of this trade subsidy is going to be that blue rectangle there. Now, because the domestic producer is receiving P2 even though they're selling at world price 1, they will gain that producer surplus. So that is the full producer surplus now because of the subsidy. Now consumer surplus is not gained though, because consumer surplus was always the same area because the world price has not changed at all. So that means that area there is the cost to the government that has not been gained by producer surplus, which equates to the net welfare loss.